tragedies hit, you can either turn toward God or you can turn the other direction. And that makes all the difference. And it seems to me that if you turn downward, if you turn away from God and God's people, then it's definitely, that's the Satan part. He wins.
Welcome to TBC Extra, a weekly podcast of our Sunday sermon and a little extra. I am Teresa Jenkins, the communications director here at Topeka Bible Church.
And I'm Jason Brent, the children's pastor at Topeka Bible Church, and we're glad you're here. And now for a little extra.
Welcome to TBC Extra. And now you guys might be a little shocked because Teresa and Jason are not currently in studio. We have a new set of faces for you because we finally got the Student Ministry Takeover Edition. And so today we're actually going to be telling you guys a little bit about our New York mission trip that we got to take this summer. And I wanted you guys to get a chance to hear from some of our students and some of our interns and about all of the cool ways God was working. Don't worry, we're going to get to Jim's sermon and then get a discussion with Jim and Teresa after, but don't skip ahead. I think you guys will really like this. So before we get into that, I'm going to have our panel here introduce themselves. So we'll start to my right.
I'm Caleb Cleverton. I'll be a senior at Care Paravel Latin School. I've been a part of the student ministry for about 4 years. So I've loved it here, and I'm glad that I got to go on that mission trip.
Yeah. I'm Abby Richards, and I'm also going to be a senior at Care Paravel, and I've also been a part of the student ministry for probably about 5 years as well.
My name is Evan Will. I will be a sophomore in college at John Brown University, and this is my first year interning with the Topeka Bible Church Student Ministry.
My name is Kaden Fluke. This is my second year interning with the student ministry, and I'll be a student at Manhattan Christian College this semester.
And I'm Lori Tennyson. I'm the student ministry assistant here at TBC, and this was actually the 5th time I got to take this trip, and it was absolutely amazing.
Well, as you guys are already getting a hint of, we loved our experience in New York. For those of you who don't know, once every 3 years, we take the student ministry out of Kansas, out of the cornfields, and we transport them all the way to the lovely city of New York. And we hit the streets for about a week and we evangelize. We start conversations with people. We hear their stories. We hear where they're at spiritually. And then if they're willing and they let us, we get the chance to share the good news of the gospel. And so these guys all had experiences with probably several dozen individuals over the course of the week getting to share the good news, and they had a really cool experience. So I'm going to ask them a couple questions about their experience so that you guys can get a little taste, a little insight in what our week was like. So for you guys, as a result of the New York City trip, how do you guys now feel more prepared to have a discussion about the gospel and your personal faith now that you're back home?
Yeah, that's a great question. The New York mission trip is so special because we're going out onto the streets of New York. We're not necessarily knowing who we're going to interact with, but it's just people that you feel led to. And so now that we're back here in Topeka, I feel more prepared because I know what it means to have a genuine conversation with people. I know what it means to not try and get through a checklist of spiritual words, but I know what it means to build relationships and get to know the people for who they are.
It's a great answer. Thank you. Kick over to the students. Caleb, did you have something?
Yeah. I'd say similarly to Evan, I mean, it's a very different experience talking to strangers out in New York City than it is to go out and talk to my buddies and friends at the church. So the biggest thing for me was that going into each conversation, I never knew what anybody was going to answer. And so I left with a greater understanding of what kind of some other different beliefs. And I think that helped me to understand why I believe what I believe a little better. And so being in New York and hearing those different things from those strangers, I think it helped me be able to to relate to them a little bit more, and so I could be a little bit more relational to build that like connection with them. But then also it helped me to understand why I believe the things I believe.
That's great. Yeah, I think getting to talk about our beliefs with non-believers helps us figure out, okay, where are the disagreements, and really solidify then ourselves and some of the core beliefs that we have. before we go to Lori's got another question, just kind of a piggyback off of that one. I want to hear from the ladies. What is a question that you started to use frequently when evangelizing that you want to take back with you now that you're home and use when you're talking with non-believers? Is there a particular question that you like posing after you've been doing this for a while now?
Yeah, one thing that I found, it got into a very easily spiritual conversation, was just, hey, I'm walking around asking about spiritual beliefs. Are you spiritual? And if so, what do you believe? Or what are the truths that you hold to? Because that gives you the opportunity to share your side after you get a perspective and their passion. And it really furthers the bond, and it is easier, and their guard slowly comes down.
Absolutely. Yeah. So just even starting the conversation with a question and asking them, hey, what is your spiritual background? I want to hear from you. A lot of Christians get the bad rap of, hey, Christians don't care about the other person. They just want to shove their beliefs down. But starting with, hey, I do care about you. I want to hear your story. That's great. Abby, what about you?
I actually ended up stealing one from Lori a lot during my experience. And she would always go up and ask, what is the first thing you think of when I say the name Jesus? And I enjoyed using that one because it kind of gives you like immediate segue into the conversation. But also, I mean, everyone has an opinion on Jesus. It's a really widely, everyone knows who Jesus is and everyone has their opinions on it. And so it kind of gives you you know where they stand, and then you kind of know where to go from there because you know how to take it.
Absolutely. Yeah. Just bring it to Jesus. And I think you're right that everyone has some sort of answer to that question. And so giving them the chance to share is great segue. All right, Lori, you got a question for him.
I do. Is there anything the Lord opened your eyes to on this trip that you really hadn't considered or been aware of before when it came to sharing the gospel?
One thing I got quite a few times with the students as we were walking around is a lot of times when we would talk to older folks on the streets and in the parks, they would tell us, you guys are so young, you don't understand. Whatever you're believing in, it's going to change next month. And so them telling us that information only made us want to tell the gospel even more. And it was eye-opening, and we had great conversations with the students afterwards about that discouraging or a couple of discouraging conversations, but it really put into the perspective that this is my faith, this is what I believe, and I am not too young to be doing this. In fact, I am happy that I came here, and I'm glad that I am pushing those boundaries. And so even for me personally, I'm only 20, and being told that I am too young to do something was something I've not really thought about or been told before, especially when it comes to sharing the gospel. And so it was no, I can. And it made me happy to kind of have that moment with the students and also take those conversations in a respectful way.
That's great. And I think from the other side, from those we were witnessing to, yeah, there were some who maybe scoffed, like, you guys are too young, you don't know what you're talking about. But there were a lot of others who were like, man, these kids know what they believe. Like, they've done their homework, they've done their research. And so even though we had a couple discouraging moments, it was cool that we got to share our faith and share that we've done our due diligence, and we have a reason for the hope, right, that we have, as Paul talks about. What about you guys?
I say that previously to this trip, I mostly thought of evangelism as to family members or acquaintances that I knew that didn't believe in the gospel. But this trip kind of grew my empathy for strangers and people that I just see in everyday, day-to-day life. And when I was meeting these people that I wouldn't normally just go up to in my everyday life, it kind of grew my empathy, and I was like, I want that guy just sitting on the bench over there to be in heaven too, you know? And so it kind of makes me think now, there's a lot of people that I just pass by and wouldn't normally interact with, but it kind of grew my empathy of I care for those people too. And what if they've never heard the gospel before?
That's great. And that's one of the reasons we take this trip is we should have a love for all of God's people. And this gives you the eyes to see them in that light, how Jesus sees them, right? So I'm so glad you got to take that away with you. Anyone else want to share a perspective that they gained from this trip
Yeah, I was going to say similar to what Abby said. I mean, everyone has gone through like certain trials in their lives, right? And so hearing, talking to those strangers, there's so many different stories that I heard of like bad things that had happened to people. And so often were those their excuses or their reasons for not being a Christian or not believing in a God or whatever God they did believe in. So I guess for me, like hearing how many like negative things have happened to people. And I know that I've come through trials, but I've like in the grand scheme of things, I've had it pretty easy. Growing up, in the church and in a good home. So I guess similar to what Abby said, it like grew my love for others. And it really like, every time I walked by someone, I wanted to share with them because I knew that I wanted to give them that same safety line that I have, which is God. I wanted to give them that same, reason to believe that I have. And so I think that is one thing that I took away from that's like one of the major things I took away from New York is that, everyone's gone through things. And so everyone deserves to hear the gospel and everyone needs to hear the gospel.
Thank you. It's a great answer. I want to transition to our next question, but maybe some of our listeners, as you guys have tuned in and found out you were jump scared with evangelism, maybe even started getting a little mini panic attack. Just the idea of going up to a stranger and trying to share the gospel was really scary, and I get that. It's a big fear for a lot of people. But now that you guys have done it, some of you have done street evangelism in the past, but this was a pretty intense thing to do for an entire week. Would you encourage other people to do it now? Is it something that's manageable? Is it something that's good? I want to hear your perspective now that you're on the other side.
Yeah, I would 100% encourage believers and people in the church to go spread the gospel. Go tell others about the good news that you know about. Not just because it's fulfilling and heartwarming for you when you get to share the gospel with other people, but simply because that's what Christ calls us to do. I think about the Great Commission in the book of Matthew. Christ tells us to go and tell others about him. He tells us to go and make disciples of all nations. And so while these stories of, this person came to Christ, this person accepted the gospel, while those are encouraging, that's not our only motivation. Our motivation is because that's what we're called to do as believers. So yeah, that's why I would encourage people to go and spread the gospel.
Thanks, Evan. What about one of you guys?
I would absolutely encourage street evangelism as well, because I think it seems, at least to me, it seemed really like high stakes and stressful before I went there. But I think that I came away from it thinking that was probably the best way to start, because in the grand scheme of things, it's kind of a little bit low stakes because most likely you're not going to see most of those people again. And I think that street evangelism is a way that we experience really good experiences and really bad experiences, and then we experience the in-between. And I think that like going up to all those strangers in New York City kind of gave you the spectrum. You experienced, I had really good days, really bad days, and I had kind of middle experiences. And I think that kind of gave me the chance to get out of the like unknown. And so now evangelism doesn't seem as scary to me. Especially to like people I don't know or people I do know. I think I had like a big fear of hearing no before, but once I heard the no, it kind of helped me. I had a really bad first day personally. I didn't get a lot of interactions. I got shut down pretty quickly, but it actually helped me throughout the rest of the days because I'd already heard the no. And so it wasn't as scary anymore once I experienced all that.
Right. You're still here.
Yeah.
You're still here.
Exactly.
I survived.
No, I think that's great when we experience that, rejection, even the worst that we could experience on that trip really wasn't all that bad. That gives us a lot more confidence going into it. I want to piggyback before we jump to our next question. What was y'all's experience generally with people's openness to talking about spiritual things? Because I think that's a lot of, a big reason holds many of us back maybe from having spiritual conversations, like, oh, people don't want to talk about that. Like they get really defensive or want to change the topic. What was y'all's experience with that?
I'd say, New York's a little intimidating. So going straight to New York to evangelize, it can be, I was pretty nervous going into it. But I think that like people love to share and people care about the things they care about. And so if you show that you're caring, and that I think it's so important to build a relationship to start. So, we talked about it a little bit earlier when you ask an opening question. So just to see if somebody's holding a soccer ball, you ask, oh, do you play soccer? Like, oh man, like that's such a cool sport. Who's your favorite player? Just things to build relationships, I think, are so important because that builds a connection between you two. And then as you move through that conversation, now you're talking as friends and you're not talking as strangers. Once you get to know a little bit about someone, then you can kind of move into like an actual close relationship and you can talk to them as friends. So I think once you've built that bond, I think like then all that sharing, they were so very open. And once I was able to get past that step of building that connection, I had no problem getting people to share and getting even the most like strangers. I've never met them before, never will see them again. They were so willing to share with a 17-year-old male from Topeka, Kansas. So that was really awesome, and I think that's why.
That's great. Either of you two have anything to add there?
Yeah, people were actually very open. One thing I was very surprised with is once you started that connection, like Caleb said, is that when you ask that question, like, are you spiritual at all? A lot of people down in New York City have these spiritual truths to some extent that they believe in, because with the culture there itself, like, you kind of get lost in the sauce if you don't have like firm foundation of who you are, because of just that environment and the business. And so when people get the chance to share that with you, they get excited. The only hard part is navigating that and applying it to the gospel that you believe, because we all heard some crazy stuff on the street, but at the same time, it gave you the opportunity to listen. And that is one of the main things that evangelism requires, is listening, not just defending the gospel, but listening to other people. And that was one thing that made it difficult for me personally with spiritual conversations. But once we got into that, it was such a good experience, because not only was I thinking, how am I going to share the gospel in a way that they understand, but they got the chance to talk to me about what they believed, any questions they had about Christianity, their understanding, some pain, and that is, again, building that trust.
Yeah. Great. Thank you. Lori, you want to hit him with the next question?
Yeah, just to finish up, we were wondering if you guys had any fun or interesting stories in particular that you wanted to share from the trip.
Yeah, so relating to evangelism, I had a conversation with a gentleman in Washington Square Park. It was our first day in New York doing evangelism, and I had started a conversation with this guy based off of the shoes that he was wearing. I said, those are some nice shoes. Are you into fashion, or what do you like about those shoes? And so a simple question like that, even a dumb question maybe, that sparked a whole conversation. And I was able to find out that he had grown up in the church, but had experienced a lot of hurt. He had been wronged by some people, and was just feeling that God did not really love him. And so the way that conversation went, I was able to show him all the ways throughout his life that Christ has shown his love for him, that God has provided for him and taken care of him. And by the end of it, he was crying because he was realizing how the Lord did truly love him, and that all of the hurt and the pain that he was feeling was from humans, not from God. And so that conversation was powerful for me because it made me realize, man, the Lord's love is so unconditional. There's nothing that we do that equals God's love for us, and yet he still gives it to us every day. So that was a super cool conversation that I got to have.
No, praise God. That's so awesome. And just, I think it's very powerful that we get to be a manifestation of God's love through evangelism. And a lot of people told us that throughout the week. What about you two? Any cool stories you'd like to leave them with?
Yeah. So for me, mine was, I think, the second day, but it was also in Washington Square Park. James Osborne and I, who I was evangelizing with at the time, we were kind of having a bad day, struggling to get people to talk to. Nobody was really willing to talk to us so far as we had gone. And then we were kind of approaching this young lady to go talk to her. And right as we walked up, another person walked up to go talk to her, not from our group. So we kind of got intercepted a little bit there. And so we were standing in the middle of this park, just staring in disbelief, that's so unlucky. And then from behind us, these two, I'd say around 20 years old, they asked us a question. And so we turned around and, we like answered their question. We're talking to them, and we ended up having like an hour and a half conversation with them. And they were so very nice, so very open. And kind of what they struggled with Christianity was they had a lot of their friends who were Christians, they said did everything they did that was good was just so that God would see them and so that hopefully they would get a bigger reward in heaven. And they really hated that concept. They both grew up in the church, but just that concept alone of seeing their friends be like, they kept using the word fake. They would say that their friends were being so incredibly fake, and they were doing everything that they did that was good. They would do all the things like donating to charity, evangelize, all that stuff, but it was for the sole purpose of getting a greater reward in heaven. And so hearing that, I think it was kind of, and just knowing that they were so open, it was really easy for James and I to dive in and to continue that conversation with them, because it was then easy for us to talk about why we were evangelizing, because hearing that, maybe that's what they were thinking we were doing, was just that we gain a greater reward. And so in that conversation, we were able to share why we wanted to evangelize and why we chose to evangelize, why we chose to even come on the trip. And that was a super, super powerful conversation. They were awesome, amazing people, loved talking to them. And it was super cool to even see at the end, they had so many questions for us. They had so many like super, super interesting questions that I hadn't even thought about myself. But, and then even at the end, we just handed them a couple tracts, and to see them reading over them and discussing them together, we got to see that as we were walking away, and that was super cool. And it was like, that was super heartwarming in itself, just to see that at the end, that they truly cared enough to talk about it after. So.
Yeah, that's so great. Yeah, and the two we heard are just, two of many fantastic conversations and ways that God was working. So I encourage you guys to, if you get the chance, stop Lori and I. If you know there's a student who went on the New York trip, stop them, ask them more about their experience and the ways God was working. Real quick, I'm going to do a podcast no-no and break the fourth wall. Peter, are we still a little good on time? Yeah? Okay, I'm getting yes. So what I want is one more question, rapid fire answer. Okay. I'm going to be super honest. We're not just parading these guys in front of you to warm your heart with the good things that God was doing, although we do want to do that. But we also, one of our hopes is that we would be a church that evangelizes. We would be a church that's going out beyond our walls, and this would be an encouragement to you that it can be done. But I know we all carry fears when it comes to evangelizing, whether it's to a friend or someone on the street. And so what I want from you guys is, can you tell me one thing that maybe was holding you back from evangelism, or maybe a fear that you just carried into evangelism that after this trip is not as much of an issue for you anymore, because you saw that God was still going to work through that, or it wasn't actually going to be as big of a deal as you thought, if that makes sense. So we'll start with Caden, and we'll just work our way this way, okay?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one fear that definitely stopped me from, like, in my tracks when trying to share the gospel and talk to people was just the idea of hurting someone's like feelings. Like, I hate seeing when people are upset. I hate seeing when they are mad at me. And again, that's kind of a people-pleasing habit. But when I see their faces starting to change, they're starting to get uncomfortable. Yes, that's normal when it comes to evangelizing, but I don't know their past. I don't know where they're at in life. And I'm terrified of hurting them deep down and being a bad representative of Christ. And so that was a fear that I had that the enemy tried to have on me, but praise God, we made it through.
Yeah, a fear that I had was simply knowing what questions to ask. When it came to like small talk, obviously I asked the question, I like your shoes. Where'd you get those? So that was a fear that I had. How do you have small talk with someone when I would desire to have a spiritual conversation? But it's really just like taking interest in who the person is, taking note of what clothes they're wearing, maybe what drink they're drinking. Simple stuff like that God showed me. It's as simple as asking a question. So yeah.
Yeah, I would agree with what Caden said. I'm a big people pleaser too, and I was really afraid of hurting anyone's feelings. But I found that like throughout the trip, as long as you were going into it lovingly and like you were asking them questions and showing that you were generally like interested in them as a person and what they had to say, and you weren't just trying to like push your beliefs on them, I really didn't find that people didn't really get hurt when they knew that you were genuinely listening. And even though I had some people that I talked to that had like wildly different beliefs from me, but we were still able to have a loving conversation, because if you don't really give them something to be upset about, usually they don't get too triggered. So it made it a lot less scary for me after I experienced that.
Yeah, I'd say for me, it's, it kind of still is that not having all the answers to every question they ask. I think it can be kind of scary to be in any sort of conversation with someone, but especially evangelizing, when they ask you a question and you don't know the answer to it. And so that kind of originally was what held me back a little bit from approaching certain people, would be just because, oh man, I feel like I'm not going to be able to answer this question, or any question, not even ones that I knew. But, and so I think, and what I've taken from New York is that sometimes not knowing the answer can sometimes even be a little bit better than knowing the answer. Because if some people would ask me a question, and if I didn't know it, but I would just say, man, that's a really good question, I really don't know. I think that feels a little bit less like it's a presentation from me, or I'm up there preaching to them, more than it's just a conversation. Like I didn't bring any notes, we're just talking. And so maybe I don't know this, but we gave a lot of people our, the Jews for Jesus Instagram. So, hey, here's the Instagram. Please ask them, and I'm sure they'll come back to you with an answer, or, give them my number, all those different things. But so I think that was a big fear of mine. I've happily overcome that after New York. So
cool. Well, thank you all for sharing. And I hope you too will overcome any fears that the enemy has placed in your way that might be keeping you from evangelizing that friend, that family member, that person who works behind the counter at your favorite grocery store. Because everyone deserves a chance to hear the gospel, the good news. And with that, let's kick it over to Jim and see what he has to say. Thank you.
Good morning, kids. How you doing? Wasn't this one of those mornings where you're listening to the thunder and hearing the rain, you're going, I could sleep all day. I'd love to just stay here, but you didn't. You got up. Yeah, you're late, but second service, back row in heaven. So just kidding. You made it. Fantastic. By the way, about the interns, every year I say the same thing. Best set of interns we ever had. True again this year. Just amazing. So let's be generous to them. I will be. But we're so blessed to have those 6 interns at TBC to help out Jeremy and Caroline during the summer. So we're in a series, if you're visiting, called Onward. That's a rocket, and it's about just basic Christian life. I mean, the first week was on the 20th of July. Connor preached Blast Off, and that's about the gospel. It's about evangelism. It's about, how to enter the family of God. And then the week after that was looking back. Once you're now a Christian, your identity. What does that mean? Who you are. Knowing who you are is just super significant until until you know that you'll live like who you think you are. Last week, navigation, and in the end, Connor challenged us to, go to the GPS of the Bible, navigate, and read the Word every day. So I have this week, Houston, we have a problem, right? Now, unless you're over 60, you weren't alive to be one of the 40 million people they say were watching their TVs in 1970, starting the third day of the Apollo 13 trip, the third lunar landing it was supposed to be. There's Jim Lovell, there was Jack Swigert, there was Fred Hayes, and they took off on April the 11th. And things almost, after a couple days, went south. By the way, it's really relevant. Decided to preach this. And then Jim Lovell, 2 days ago, died at age 97. He was the commander of the crew on that trip. Wonderful man, and had a big hand in the movie, 1995, called Apollo 13. You have to be probably 45 years old to have seen that live. But all of you, I think, have been in school and you were supposed to, 6th grade, 7th grade, you were supposed to learn about this. So, right? And I'm sure you've heard the story. But the story is a cool story. So you have these guys in 1970 who Jim Lovell had more experience at the time than any other astronaut in space. It was played in 1995 by Bill Paxton. Tom Hanks played Jim Lovell, the commander, and Kevin Bacon. And it was an award-winning movie. None of them, not Tom Hanks, though a lot of people predicted he would win a Best Actor, but it was actually Ed Harris back in Mission Control in Houston in that movie who won it. But the story is, of course, that what happened a couple of days in on the 13th was all of a sudden when Apollo 13, which Apollo 13 consists of 2 ships in a sense. There was the big orbiter, which is called Odysseus, I think, and it was connected through a little tunnel to a lander, which 2 of them were going to get in and go to the surface of the moon and walk on the moon, and that was called Aquarius. And so these 2 things are hooked together, and they're within 50,000 miles of the moon. They've gone 200,000 miles, and all of a sudden there's this huge bang. What they didn't know, what took them a while to find out, is that one of the big liquid oxygen tanks a fire had broken out, and it suddenly exploded, shook the whole ship, and you can see at the top there all of the, these lights came on and everything. Jim Lovell had a big hand in the movie, and so all of those things are exactly accurate, labeled right. I thought you'd want to know that. The movie, it was super accurate, except for a couple minor things. For instance, it wasn't Jim Lovell, Tom Hanks, who called back to Houston and said, "Houston, we have a problem." It was actually Jack Swigert. And he didn't say, "Houston, we have a problem." He said, "Houston, we've had a problem." But that's not nearly as exciting. But other than that, perfectly accurate. And they're wondering what it is. Turns out it's an oxygen tank, and it's damaged another oxygen tank. And this liquid oxygen actually powered all the fuel cells, the lights, the heat, everything else. It powered, the Odyssey. That's what it was, the Odyssey. So, man, they're having a terrible time in Houston, deciding what to do. And they're going, all of a sudden, can they even get to the moon? And if so, they probably certainly can't get back. This is April 13th, photograph at NASA in Houston, and they are freaking out, trying to find out what the problem is. In the movie, it's Ed Harris who stands up, who's the commander there in Houston. He says, "From this moment on, we are improvising a new mission. How do we get our people home?" And it was tough. Fortunately, they had a really brilliant guy down there in Houston, this is true to life, who convinced everybody that the only way to really get home and have everybody survive with safety was to keep going slingshot around the moon and come back, not land. And in fact, because they were going to be super low, they'd run out of power if they kept trying to power the orbiter, the main spaceship. They had to leave the orbiter. The 3 of them needed to go in, crawl through, and stay in the lander for the rest of the trip. The small lander, which was built for 2, claustrophobists, all of us freaking out at the moment. And they had to turn off all essential power, so they didn't have enough power to get back to Earth. And that's what they did. They clambered in there, turned off all non-essential power so that basically, the main orbiter, the main spacecraft now is dark and it's getting close to freezing, as is. For 3 days, 4 days they're in there with hardly any food because it's frozen, going easy, not having water rationed. They all lost weight. One of them developed a kidney infection, and they're piled on top of one another. And then when they're, an hour away from Earth, didn't they have to crawl back in, turn everything on the Odyssey because the lander burns up upon reentry. They didn't want to be in the lander for that. So, and amazingly, what's really great, as 40 million people, this is Jim Lovell's wife, Marilyn, and her family, staring like the rest of us. If you're as old as I am, you were staring, you were glued to the TV as well, wondering what's going to happen. And when finally they landed near Samoa on April 17th, 1970, and it was announced it was a successful failure because they came back alive, everybody cheered, and they won a lot of international awards. This phrase, however, then entered the lore after 25 years later, after the movie. This entered, it became really, of course, a famous line. In fact, it's rated number 50 in the 100 most famous movie lines of all time. And you know how famous it is because number 51 below it is Dirty Hair Clint Eastwood saying, you got to ask yourself one question. Do I feel lucky? Well, do you, punk? And behind that, number 52 is Renee Zellweger and Jerry Maguire. You had me at hello, right? So, Houston had a problem. You have a problem now. In fact, as a result, we use that line. I imagine you do too. We use that line in, shall we say, situations of sudden inconvenience, like you pull out the one credit card you brought. You have no cash. One credit card you brought to Walgreens, personal experience, admitted, and you keep swiping and it keeps saying rejected, 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 and under your breath you're muttering as you shake your head, Houston, we have a problem. Or you're in Chicago, personal experience, driving to a very important appointment up north of Chicago in Trinity Evangelical Divinity School, and you're traveling and traffic is just crazy. You have an 18-wheeler behind you, and now you're going across a bridge or the road below, and suddenly your driver's side tire explodes and the car pulls, and actually I didn't say Houston, I said God. We've got a problem. But it's entered our, how many of you have said Houston, we have a problem? Just come out with that. Yeah. So we use that line, but the Apollo crew would remind us that their problem was a lot more than a minor inconvenience or a major inconvenience. It was a matter of life or death. It was a high stakes matter. And I'm using it in a high stakes way today. Because according to God, that spiritual journey that you're on, that journey of faith that every believer is on, onward and upward, is a high stakes matter. It's not only high stakes to you, it's high stakes to the person that you're married to. It's high stakes to your parents, to your family, to your children, to those who have to live with you, to those that you work with. But the problem is that in that journey of faith, you will sooner or later, I bet all of you have already, you will be confronted by a mid-faith crisis. In the middle of that journey of faith, you will be confronted by a crisis that blindsides you did not expect, and it will test your faith to its life or death breaking point. And you will wonder, can I make it? Can I go on? Will my faith even endure this test? And some of you have already faced that sudden oxygen tank blowout. When the doctor said to you, I'm sorry to have to tell you this, but you have a malignant tumor. One Christian man said, I went home and I sat in a chair, I dropped my head in my hands, I couldn't move. Physically, mentally, I was in pain. I just put my hands in my head in my hands and I wept and I said, help me, God, help me, God, help me, God, please help me. Or perhaps you're like the student who had a faith blowout, who writes, it was at Cal Berkeley. He said, when everything that I trusted was suddenly taken away, the auditorium was packed. The speaker was an atheist, a scientist, a biologist named Richard Dawkins. And even though he was a biologist, his talk wasn't about science. He was more like a stand-up comedian. He equated believing in God to believing in the spaghetti monster. And the audience roared with laughter, and I felt like they were all laughing at me, not believing that anyone in our modern scientific rational world could believe in an unseen God up in the clouds. And at the end of his talk, I wondered, am I all wrong? Is my faith completely irrational? When I tell people about God, am I telling them a lie? The student had a mid-faith crisis. And by the way, I've listed the first 7 that came to my mind. Family wounds, loss of income, loss of health, desertion, addiction, mistreatment, loneliness. You've had more than one of those, haven't you? Let me read those again. Family wounds, loss of income, loss of health, desertion, addiction, mistreatment, loneliness. How many of you have had at least 2 of these? Raise your hand. Yeah. We've had those, and they've come to us like an explosion in our onward Christian rocket, you know. So if it's true that these things that come to us are allowed by God, and even sometimes sent by God, right? How can we, like the Apollo 13 crew, both the ones up in space and the ones at mission control, they received international honors like crazy for the way that they handled their life and death crisis. How can we do the same? Well, because God's the one who allows and sends them, He's definitely put stories in His Word about how to do this and given us examples. Now, I want to share you one of these right now. I want to tell you the story about a guy named Joe. Comes out of the Bible. His spiritual life started out like a rocket with a straight up trajectory, but before long he started enduring multiple oxygen tank blowouts in his life. Had 3 major ones. Let me read the story to you. Genesis 37 through 39. I'm going to summarize this. At 17 years of age, Joseph tended sheep with his brothers. Now, that's not like a rocket liftoff yet, I guess. But his father loved Joseph. Joseph was, by the way, the next to last of a dozen children, which is not a perfect birth order. But his dad loved him. Remember, gave him a special coat and so forth. And Joseph was close to God. It says he had a dream that promised him future success. But when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than them, they hated him. And they couldn't speak peaceably to him, family wounds. And when Joseph came to them, they seized him and threw him into a pit that didn't have any water. And when a caravan of Ishmaelite traders going down to Egypt passed by, his brothers pulled him out of the pit and sold him as a slave. And when the traders got down to Egypt, they sold Joseph as a slave to Potiphar, an office of Pharaoh, in fact, the captain of his guard. But then, a couple years later, when his master, Potiphar, heard a false story that his wife told him that Joseph had sexually abused her. These are the things your slaves did to me, she lied. He was furious and had Joseph thrown into a prison. So Joseph is there in prison. Family wounds, mistreatment, a mid-faith crisis. And the next line, Genesis 40, is after this, and you start looking at the dates because it tells how old they are. After this is 11 years later. 11 years after his brothers sold him. Joseph has now been in a third world prison for 10 years. The king of Egypt's cupbearer and baker, his butler and baker, made him angry. So apparently Pharaoh isn't going to kill him or anything. He just wants to remind him who's boss. He's going to dump him in a jail for a couple of weeks just to tame their attitudes. And so he put them in the prison where Joseph was confined. By the way, the word confined could also be translated shackled, and that would probably be better because David, hundreds of years later in Psalm 105 writes, they bruised Joseph's feet with shackles. His neck was an iron. Can you imagine year after year, day after day, your ankles being shackled, even having an iron ring around your neck for 10 years? And you're supposed to be watched over and loved by God? So, and then it goes even further. The captain of the guards assigned Joseph as their personal attendant. So it says Joseph a little bit later can say Joseph's in a dungeon. Imagine being Joseph. So you're shackled, but because the Egyptians are the most famous racists in the world and hated everybody who's not Egyptian, because you're a Semite, who comes from up northeast, the land of Israel, they hate you, just the look of you, and they treat you as the worst of the worst in the prison, even though you're entirely innocent. And it says they dropped him into a dungeon. So he was in a dungeon in a filthy prison, and now you get pulled out, and you go, what gives? And they say, well, we're going to make you a personal assistant slave to these two white-collar guys that have come from the palace, the butler and the baker of Pharaoh himself, and we got to treat them right because they're cool. And so now you're doing the slave thing while you're in prison. So anyway, and Joseph finally says to them when he's chatting with them, when all goes well for you, remember that I was with you. Please show kindness to me by mentioning me to Pharaoh and get me out of this prison. For I was kidnapped from the land of the Hebrews, and even here I've done nothing that they should put me in the dungeon. And on Pharaoh's birthday, the chapter ends, he restored the chief butler, cupbearer, to his position, and he hanged the chief baker just as Joseph had predicted, yet the cupbearer did not remember Joseph. He forgot him. Let's add to it. Mistreatment, desertion, loneliness. First of all, he's been sold by his brothers. And the second, oxygen tank blowout is he gets falsely accused when he's a slave in Potiphar's house. And now third, he's in the dungeon in a prison and being mistreated there. No wonder he has, we assume, a mid-faith crisis. And it just keeps hanging. Isn't it the worst when it just keeps hanging on and hanging on? I mean, the things that happen and then they're gone the next day, like the flat tire, that's one thing. But when you have a problem, a family wound or whatever, that just hangs on year after year. I mean, Mama said there'd be days like this, there'd be days like this. Mama said she failed to mention that they could go on for months at a time, or even years at a time. It's hardest when it lasts and lasts. And that's the story of a Christian woman named Mariana, who cried out, hello, God, are you even there? Mariana's story is that she was a fervent Christian, that she was in women's groups, Sunday school, she was in church, she served in VBS, she was involved in the choir when they had the choir. She did everything at the church, and for years she was super faithful to God, but she starts her personal testimony by saying, a few years ago, I almost lost my faith. My mother died. My father became ill. My husband lost his job. I shattered my shoulder, couldn't work for months. I called out to God for help and got nothing but silence. Why? I demanded, deeply hurt at first by my loss, but later bitter and angry that God would take so much away. And she doesn't say, but from somebody like me who is such a faithful servant for so long. And then she says, as our trials dragged on year after year, Joseph's story, isn't it? Stress and grief consumed me. I decided that God didn't care for me. I started wondering if he was even real. Sad and sick at heart, I couldn't see any hope. I finally turned my back. My goodness. But you understand. That's what happens when you get mistreated, when you have this blowout, and you're far, like both Joseph and the Apollo 13 crew. You're super far from family and friends and protection. And you wonder. And your onward Christian rocket is shuddering under the explosion of mistreatment or loss of mother, loss of father, loss of children, loss of reputation, loss of income, loss of job, loss of all of those things just shake you to your core. So what solutions does God offer to bring us out of this midlife crisis, to bring us home successfully, to help us survive this crisis? And the answer is, and I'll just lay them out for you right up front real quick from this story of Joseph. The three things that Joe teaches us about surviving a mid-faith crisis. Number one, seize opportunities to live your faith with people. Two, hang on with a defiant faith despite mistreatment. Third, expect God to reward the endurance of your faith. It's so interesting in this chapter to realize that God sent Joseph and sends us opportunities even when we're crying out, Houston, we have a problem. The opportunity for Joe came when two new prisoners came to the prison, and they both had dreams in one night. They're two special guys. They're white-collar prisoners. They've been, eating rich food in the palace. They're soft. They're hoity-toity guys, but Pharaoh's lost his temper at them, and now they're in prison. And Joseph's pulled out of the dungeon, I said, and Joseph treats this as an opportunity, sees it as an opportunity from God. He doesn't whine. He doesn't complain. And when he wakes up in the morning, notice second line, when Joseph came to them in the morning, he saw that they looked distraught. I don't know if I've got 10 years worth of dirt, pain, and scabs on me. I'm not sure I care that two white-collar rich boys look a little distraught. You know, the two who think of me as a lesser person because I'm not racially up to their level. But you know what? He says, why do you look so sad today? And they say, well, we had dreams, but there's no one to interpret them. Literally, by the way, it says in Hebrew, Joseph looked upon them, and behold, they were sad. If I had been Joseph and I looked upon them and behold, they were sad, I would have been secretly happy. I would have gone, these stuffed shirts who are used to living in luxury deserve a little bit of unpleasantness for a change. But instead of gloating, he goes, what makes you so sad? And they say, well, we had dreams, and the problem is we're not in the palace. Otherwise, we could go to the dream interpreters and those wizards, but there's no one like that here in prison. And Joseph, standing there, has a decision to make. Does he take this opportunity? Because, you know, he remembers back to when he was young, when part of this wonderful rocket liftoff of his life, love of his Father and love with God, is that God was giving him dreams. And God was teaching him how to interpret his dreams, and he interpreted them. Yeah, he probably shouldn't have told his brothers that he had these dreams where he was, as an adult, going to be super successful and even their authority. That didn't work out too well. But he was having these dreams, and it was part of his faith thing. It was part of who he was, part of his identity and so forth, and he remembers that. But should he tell these strangers that? Should he risk himself? You know, are they worth that risk? Something so personal to him, something so central to his faith in God. It's an opportunity. Does he take that opportunity? I might have just kept my mouth shut, but he sees the opportunity. And he says, don't interpretations belong to God? Tell me your dreams. I'll give it a shot. Try me. And I just want to say, listen for a second. Some of you are going through, you know, you're in a hellhole. You're going through something really bad. But even when you're sick and pain and hurting, the really blunt news is that God says in Romans 14, none of us, that Paul says in Romans 14, none of us lives for ourselves alone. Not even when you're hurting. None of us dies for ourselves alone. If we live for the Lord. And if we die for the Lord. So whether we live or die, we belong to the Lord. And so Paul, he left it out, but the next line was, so get your butt out of the chair and seize the opportunity. No, something like that. But in mid-faith crises, God gives you opportunities, and in those very moments, seize the opportunities to live your faith with others. For example, in the last year or two, because of the cancer that Melody went through, Melody and I have been presented with when people come up to us and tell us, sometimes in whispers, that they've just received a diagnosis and they are really hurting, and they know that Melody can identify with them really well. And we gulp a little bit, but we always say to them, listen, have you ever heard of Caring Bridge? It's a website. And I know you don't feel like it right now. You can hardly get out of your fetal position. You can hardly even come to church. You're hurting so bad. Go online, look at Caring Bridge. God may really want you to log in and start your own story, because people will read that, and you can share your faith. You can share how you're going through it. And we say, Melody has never been so deluged with thousands of comments from across the nation from people who read her Caring Bridge and saw her faith and were encouraged. God gives us opportunities even when we're going through great darkness to live our faith with others. Seize that opportunity. I think it's Chuck Swindoll who said, we are all faced with a series of great opportunities brilliantly disguised
as impossible situations. So Joseph says, tell me your dreams and I'll interpret them. And you can tell right away that somehow Joseph has decided, he understands that God, that he's hanging on to God with such a defiant faith that he has concluded that God is simply testing him year after year and making him a better person. Because we read in the next 7, 8 verses, this is the interpretation of your dream, Joseph says to the butler. The 3 branches are 3 days, and in 3 days, just 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head. They'll restore you to your position. And you'll put Pharaoh's cup in his hand the way you used to when you were his cupbearer. When the chief baker saw the interpretation was positive, he said to Joseph, hey, I also had a dream. 3 baskets of white bread on my head, top basket, all sorts of baked goods for Pharaoh. Birds were eating him out of the basket. Well, Joseph, I think he took a deep breath and he goes, oh, crud. Do I really have to explain this? And this is its interpretation, Joseph replied. The 3 baskets of 3 days, in just 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head too from off you and hang you on a tree. Then the birds will eat the flesh of your body. Okay. But basically the same interpretation. It's just one of you gets your head lifted up a little farther than you'd rather. Now, I know that sounds like beheading, but until Islamic radicals and French Revolution, they didn't have guillotines. So as he says here, he was hanged on a tree. It's a figure of speech. But I mean, isn't that amazing that Joseph somehow was hung on to his defiant faith to such an extent that he thought, you know what, I don't know if it's still true, but I think God is the same God. And I think he's a God who gives dreams and allows me to interpret them. And so I'm just going to go forward with it. It's astounding. And it's a sign of his faith, and it's a sign of his wisdom that he has decided that God is testing him, which turns out to be exactly right. When tragedy strikes, we enter a crisis of faith. We either move toward God or away from God. And if you just hang on with a defiant faith, you move toward God. If you jettison your faith, if you quit the family of God, if you stay away, as Hebrews 10, don't forsake the assembling together, then you know what? Then you move away from God. Interesting thing is, it almost doesn't matter who you were before the crisis hits. That crisis defines you better than anything else. There's a king of ancient Israel named Ahaz. If you want to look it up, 2 Chronicles 28. King Ahaz lived sort of a mediocre life. He's under 50% as a king. He's not a 70%er or a 90%er. He's not a great and godly man. But, he's not erecting false idols everywhere, and he's not attacking the faith. He's not killing the prophets and so forth. But Isaiah is struggling with trying to get him over 50%, and it's not working too well. And then Ahaz, late in life, has a real crisis. I think it's a serious foot problem or something. He has a serious, he has one of those moments where there's a blowout in his body. And then you have this amazing line in 2 Chronicles 28. Even in his problem, Ahaz did not turn to God, but turned away from God. And there's not much story left after that because Ahaz goes straight downhill. A couple chapters later, you have Ahaz's grandson. His name is Manasseh, who is, bar none, the worst king Israel ever had. And unfortunately, he lives the longest. 55 years he's on the throne. And Manasseh, it tells us clearly, was the worst king Israel ever had. Shutters down the temple, builds false idols everywhere. It's just a horrible mess. But you have at the end of Manasseh's story this strange statement. And Manasseh basically did something wrong with his gut. His whole body started falling apart. And in his tragedy, Manasseh turned and sought the Lord. He repented of his sin, and the Lord forgave him. Like in the last 6 months of his life. And you have this horrible person who all of a sudden when the oxygen tank explodes and everything's, goes to hell, he turns toward God. Listen, I don't know, we don't know what each other's lives have been like in the past. If you're like me, you have a whole lot of things you regret, but there's coming a moment in your life that's absolutely critical. And it's like, the ninth inning is the most important inning. Overtime or the fourth quarter is the most important quarter. It's what you do at the end of the game that really matters. It's what you do when the chips are down. And maybe it's not the end of the game for you. Maybe you're 23 years old and you got the verdict of cancer, as a woman did here not long ago. How are you going to respond at that moment? Will you turn toward God or will you turn away from God? That's the crisis of faith. It's a mid-faith journey crisis. Your response, a defiant faith that endures, is the one you want. And as a result, you can expect God. Oh, I just had this picture in my mind. Okay. This is how bad I am. Okay. Don't look up to me, because here's the picture that came to mind. I didn't tell this first service because my mind was probably working in a more spiritual way. I just had this picture, true story, had this picture of the mall and the boy who was standing next to the escalator, not in the way. People were getting on, but he's just standing next to it. He's gazing at the steps coming out of the floor and at the hand, the hand thing that goes up, and he's just staring there, and the sales lady's looking at him, and he's just there. 5 minutes, 10 minutes, finally she comes on. Are you scared to get on? He goes, no. Is there something wrong? You lost? No. I'm sorry, what are you doing? He says, I'm just waiting for my chewing gum to come around. It's a terrible illustration. It's just terrible. But the issue is, he's standing there firm and he's waiting, okay? That's the only connection it has with this story, that you should stand firm, wait, that you should endure. Forgive me, okay. There's very little about that story that you should model in your own life, okay? But it's going to happen because the reward of your faith has come. I don't know if the chewing gum ever came. But God promises that he will reward the endurance of your faith in the New and Old Testament. Genesis 40, 20-23, on the third day, which is Pharaoh's birthday, Pharaoh gave a feast for all his servants. He elevated the chief cupbearer and the chief baker among them, restored the chief butler to his position, placed the cup, but Pharaoh hanged the baker just as Joseph had explained. Can you imagine how Joseph felt when he got the word that his prediction of the dreams had come literally true? He must have gone, yes! Yes, it still works. God really still cares for me. God is still communicating with me. And he's looking at the front door because, somebody's, he'd gotten the butler to promise that he's going to tell Pharaoh if that works out. And he's waiting. And every time someone knocks on the prison door, comes in and talks to the warden, Joseph's got his ear. Are they going to come? They're going to get me loose? No, they're not. Because the next line is, the chief cupbearer did not remember Joseph. He forgot. 2 more years of this agony, of this pain. Turn to chapter 41. No chapters in the original text. It's just the very next line in the Hebrew is 2 years later, Pharaoh had a dream. 2 years later, Pharaoh had a dream. And before that chapter ends, you have Pharaoh saying to Joseph, I hereby put you in charge of the whole land of Egypt. And Joseph turns 30 years of age. He had been a long time, been 13 years of pain and suffering, but God rewarded the endurance of his faith. Years later, 400 or 500 years later, King David loves the story of Joseph, is learning from Joseph because he writes about Joseph, and there's a lot of parallels in the lives of David, King David and Joseph, who lived so many hundreds of years before. But you have this line in verse 19 of David's Psalm 105, until the time came to fulfill his dreams, God's time, the Lord tested Joseph's character. Eventually, he fulfilled his dreams. But he tested his character until that point, and Joseph understood that's exactly what was happening, and so as a result, he recognized the opportunity that came when he was at his darkest point, and he seized that opportunity because he recognized that he was being tested. What he did is his faith was defiant, and it hung on, and as a result, he was there at the end, when God rewarded his endurance. Remind yourself, dear friends, I am not in a cave. It seems like a cave that you're in. Seems like it has no end. I'm not in a cave. I'm in a tunnel. Go onward. I have no idea. Yeah, I do. I have an idea of what I'd have done if I was on the crew of the Apollo 13. Yeah, I'd have had a lot of trouble. I think I don't know, but I probably do know if I was Joseph, and it had been year after year of mistreatment, of racism and abuse, family desertion. I'm not sure I would have handled that very well. I have a hard enough time with an expired credit card or a flat tire. So I guess all I can say is, why don't we together remind ourselves when there's a blowout in our lives and something goes terribly wrong and it's really important. Remind ourselves that God will give us an opportunity even now to live our faith out with others. That's going to lead right into, by the way, next week's talk, I think, by Connor. And not only should we seize those opportunities, we should, at those times, especially maintain a defiant faith that said, I don't care what you do, devil. I'm going to hang on and expect God's reward. Look down that tunnel and say, this looks like a cave right now, but I know there's a light at the end of it. Let's together go onward in our faith journey. Okay? Let's pray. Father, thank you for this story, and thank you for the example in real life of Jim Lovell and the others, and the example of Christians. Thank you for sending friends to pull Mary Ann out of her slump and bring her back to church and faith. And those that we love, Lord, who wandered away because of some of these blowouts, we pray for them. We ask that you'll give us an opportunity that we will seize. And Lord, make us enduring people. Make us the kind of people that just hang on with grit and never let go all the way to the end, all the way to the light. In Jesus' name, amen. Bless you. Have a good week.
Welcome back into the studio. It is me and Jim. Jim, thank you.
Hi, Teresa.
For coming by. We're so
My
glad
pleasure.
you're here. Wow, those interns and students and then our student ministry staff, they have just concluded one of the most amazing summers. As you said during the sermon, each year, like this is the best group of interns, and it's always true. I love what Abby Richards had to say about their trip to Manhattan or to New York. When she was there, she felt like she was able to just develop some empathy for the people who are right there, that she could see, the guy on the park bench, and she wanted him to go to heaven. Yeah. And she wanted to give him a chance to hear the gospel. And it's good to get away from our comfort zone. And like Caleb said, chances are if we make a mistake, we're not going to meet these people again. It's different.
It speaks a lot to the influence of the Holy Spirit on her life, because most of us, you go to Manhattan or I've gone on that trip several times, and you're overwhelmed and you're scared and it feels secular. And instead of compassion, when you see those people, you feel fear. And it's really a wonderful thing. Like an 80-year-old guy that I just met with over lunch speaking, he was there and saw the interns thing on Sunday morning, and he says, that's why this church is here.
Yeah. Well, you can continue to help support that program just with your ordinary offering. I know we don't ever talk about giving really very often here on the podcast, but if you feel moved, please feel free to make a gift to either the student intern offering, that's just for a limited time this week, or our general offering, which that just goes to the student ministry
just
fund.
let us know, tag your check that way. Just mention, interns or something like that.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you for considering doing that. All right, we're going to pivot back to your sermon now.
Okay.
As you continue, we're going to move onward to your onward.
Onward.
Were there any things that you didn't get to talk about or that you thought about later that you would like to share that didn't get covered fully?
No,
on
I
Sunday?
really, no, I finished about 5 or 8 minutes early, partly because I felt like I'd said it all. All the important stuff. I mean, there are cute little things. There are interesting little things, of course, in the Bible that it's interesting how Joseph, started his, he was beloved as a boy. He was the golden child. And then his trip downward started by being thrown into a pit by his brothers. Hebrew word is bor, B-O-R. And his trip 13 years later to go and, to be blessed by God and have those dreams accomplished was being pulled out of a pit in Egypt in the prison, B-O-R. And it's interesting the way that story just kind of pivots around being in 2 pits, one of them that took him downhill, and somehow he endured and trusted throughout that 13-year mid-faith crisis. And then the Lord blessed him at age 30.
Can we just talk about how long that is?
That's incredible.
Do we know how old Joseph was when he died?
When he died, what was he, 100? It was 120? I think it was 120.
So this is 10% of his life, which that's significant. I mean, that's just that's not a few weeks, months, a year or two. That is a long,
and it's
time.
Interesting that in Egyptian lore, in Egyptian mythology, and in Egyptian religion, 120 was the perfect number of years for a pharaoh to live, for a leader, that just showed God's blessing on him. And so it's really significant that they honored him in the last line of the book of Genesis, and they embalmed him, which they only did for their nobles
just
and
the
pharaohs.
esteemed, highly esteemed nobles. Okay. Speaking of Joseph, I'll get the readers out here. His testing that he went through.
Oh my.
How do we distinguish between when God is testing us, or we're just receiving natural consequences, or we're under spiritual attack?
Yeah.
Or can all of those things, can it be 2 or 3 of those things at once? How do we distinguish?
Yeah, so that's such a great question. And it is a common question, but it's a question that if you answer it honestly and humbly, you have to say, well, we don't know. That would be one answer. It's hard to tell, which makes it even harder to endure because we're not sure. Temptation is generally that's Satan. In the denomination that I was in for a while, we blamed everything on Satan. And the other reason it's difficult, Teresa, is that sometimes those things are in the Bible overlay. For instance, when David numbers the people in the last chapter of Samuel, and it says, and Satan incited him to do it. But in Chronicles, it says, and God tested David by sending him by moving him into counting the people. It was an act of pride. So sometimes it's both. Sometimes, fortunately, God's sovereignty is that he always oversees it. And what he does is he takes some of these things that Satan thinks will break us, and he then turns them into a test.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And I could see that God's testing and natural consequences could often be hand in hand because God designed nature and the natural consequences, and that could just be part of his tool that he uses to help discipline us.
Yeah, that quote I think is so helpful. I put up a quote, I forget who it's by, Epperson or something, that when tragedies hit, you can either turn toward God or you can turn the other direction, and that makes all the difference. And it seems to me that if you turn downward, if you turn away from God and God's people, then it's definitely, that's the Satan part. He wins. But since God's using it to test, if you turn toward God, then you pass the test.
Very good. I've got a next question for you. I'm going to guess this is something you hear a lot, especially from people who have come to you in crisis, when they're grieving, when they're struggling with something that's happened to them or a loved one. And that is about reconciling God's sovereignty with human responsibility when we're the victims of others' sinful choices.
Yeah.
How do we reconcile those things?
Yeah. Again, I think it's similar to the question about God and Satan. Because God's interplay with Satan, God's interplay with humanity, God is always sovereign, but he grants us so much. He grants Satan more freedom than he wish he would grant him. And eventually he won't. He'll chain him up for 1,000 years. But he grants us amazing freedom. And Randy Alcorn, in his book, titles his wonderful book, best book I read on the subject, is called Hand in Hand. And on the title cover of that book, it's small HANDINN, capital HAND. That is, we go through life, our little hand in God's hand, and he gives us freedom, just as a daddy gives his kid who's holding his hand. And God allows our decisions to make a huge difference. And on the other hand, he oversees the whole thing and brings about his perfect will.
There have been times, Jim, that I will admit here in this podcast studio, let's just keep it between us, okay? That I've told God, I thank you for free will. I thank you. I really ask that you just take it away from me.
Yeah.
Because I don't know how to use it appropriately.
Right, wouldn't we have a horrible God though? If when I think about this, I think about a horrible time. I was away at college when my mother, who's extremely busy with 10, 12 children, she and my dad was gone overseas. She put little Dougie, redheaded 2-year-old, in a big milk bucket to bathe while she went outside and hung up the wash. Well, the milk bucket was right next to the washer. The washer was broken, and so there was a rubber tube, and it went over, and it was close to him. And Dougie leaned out of the bucket, picked up that tube as it was emptying that boiling hot soapy water, and put it in the milk bucket. And he died 2 weeks later. But it was a horrible time, and I flew home from college and went into the room and helped make the decision that, to do what we had to do. And if it was all God's sovereignty, I mean, it was so hard for my mother. She had to write poetry. She wept. It was hard for her to realize, to think about her blame in that, it was horrible. On the other hand, if it had all been God in his sovereignty wanted to kill a 2-year-old, what kind of a God would that be? So in the testings and in the pains of life, if we think about them honestly, we're happy for that combination that God gives us freedom even when we misuse it. And yet he's in charge.
And that freedom also is the freedom to think critically about your faith.
Yeah.
And we talked before the camera started rolling that we're just hearing from a lot of people who are, maybe there's church hurt, or maybe there's other things that they are really having a crisis of faith.
Yeah.
And some of these people are people who've been in ministry. I had an encounter with a gal last weekend who had been a worship leader at a church, and she asked what I do, and she said, "Oh, I used to work in ministry, and then I got hurt by some people in the church, and now I've been in a process of deconstructing my faith." And I wish I had taken that moment. We were in mixed company, and I didn't have the courage of our students who were here this morning to say, "What'd you learn from that? What are you doing about reconstruction?" Why is my question, is why do you feel like we are, or why do you agree that we're experiencing a lot of people who are in a crisis of faith, or are we just hearing about it more because more people of prominence are coming forth and using their platform to express that sentiment?
That's interesting.
That was a long question.
Yeah, no, there's a couple parts to it. Is this happening more often? I feel like it is, but like you said, maybe we're just hearing about it more often. I think that in the past, though, there was more sort of submissiveness among people, that they got hurt and they always assumed it was their fault, sort of like kids coming home from school, and moms and dads used to always say, "Well, it had to be your fault. It couldn't have been the teachers." It's just the opposite now. So I feel like it's happening more often. I don't know if I said that, so just came back, the reason I think about this, I came back from family reunion, about 100 of us in Oregon, and more of the family has gone, is splitting. Most of us, all of us used to be the 100, and so, used to be strongly for Jesus. But we've had, for instance, one close sister-in-law who was in church leadership, highest possible leadership, got hurt, and instead of working it out by maintaining her faith, has turned and kept going all the way to deciding that Jesus is not the only way to God. She was a teacher in a Christian university, and, just completely turning. And I'm not sure asking her any question at all would do anything, since she has confided in me. It's all bitterness. It's all bitterness. They were horrible. And since God allowed that you must not be God. Yeah.
Yeah, that's heartbreaking. So what do we do when we have someone who, we have that kind of relationship where there's a common trust, and we think that they're starting to drift away from God because of a mid-faith crisis, or from church hurt or something. How would you approach that? And I'm sure that there is a different answer. It's based on the person and the kind of relationship you had, but what's a good place to start?
Well, it's nice that this is a nice transition to, I think, the next week's sermon in the Onward series, which is about relationships in the family of God. I'm glad that I read the story of a woman named Marianne last week in preparation for my sermon, who grew up, and she was, 3 times a week in church. Sunday school, grew up Sunday school. She was in leadership, women's ministry, all these things. And then, to her shock, when she is close to God and looked up to, her mother dies, her father gets deathly ill, she has to wait on him. Her husband loses his job, and so all of a sudden they, have to get rid of their home. And she has a good job, but she hurts her shoulder in such a way that she's off work. And she says, I'm embarrassed to admit it, but I just kept saying, why, God? Why all of these? Why these 4 hammerheads? Why all of these? And so it went month after month, and then it was a year, and then 2 years, and none of them changed. And she says, finally, I confess to you, I stopped coming to church. I had stopped getting involved. And she says, you know what brought me back? Or she said, the people in the church would not allow me to leave. They would not allow me to give up my faith. Even when they didn't say anything to me, they just brought over food, they hugged me, they cried with me. So I know it sounds like a shallow answer, but I think when we see people like that, we maybe should handle them the same way we handle someone who's gotten the terrible news about cancer. We don't necessarily give them an answer. We just hug them, hold them, say we want to see them again, and please, 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 please don't leave our Bible study,
Yes. And that's why the connect part of our Discover, Connect, Serve pathway is so important.
So critical.
It's one thing to show up, 5 minutes before the service begins, go get in your normal seat, experience the service, and then leave right away. Yeah. It's another thing when the people. I have nothing against people sitting in the same seat everywhere. I do it. Get to know those people. That's part of your community, is those people around you, so that if on the 3rd week, Jane and Joe over here, they are not there, and they're not there the following week. Hopefully you develop some connections that you have their phone number, and then you can just say, hey, we've missed you. Yeah. What you guys up to? And let them know. I think one of the saddest things that happened in the church during 2020 was here at our church, there were 2 other churches that popped up that summer of 2020, which is fantastic. But when we lost people, we didn't know if they were going to one of those two churches. Are they still watching online?
Right, that's a good point.
So that Christmas,
Yeah.
we made a list of everybody who we thought still
Yeah, we did.
attended, and we took them a Christmas box. You remember that? That was such fun. But for the people who maybe just stopped attending and didn't go somewhere else, fell through the cracks. That's just heartbreaking that they, for whatever reason, didn't want to invest in that part of their spiritual life anymore. And
But what was that the time where we took Christmas packages to people? That was really wonderful to me, to drive to places where people would look at you and say,
we surprised a lot of people.
I haven't been to church in a while. I said, well, that's not the issue. This is just a present. Let's chat. And you spend an hour with them, and then we would see them back in church. They needed to know somebody cared and somebody loved.
Yeah. And that was a small token of what we could do to try to keep that connection and honor that some people weren't ready to come back for health reasons or whatever. We honored that, respected that, but that was a fun memory. But that's not just up to church staff. Everybody can be doing that with the people that you normally sit with or you go to Bible study with. And we need these communities.
I wonder if that's why there's only one book in the Bible that's entirely written to keep people from losing their faith, to tell them to hold on. And that's the book of Hebrews. 4 times, it gets worse and worse. In chapter 2 is don't drift away from the faith. And then chapter 6, don't step away from the faith. And then it's don't run away from the faith. And right at the end of that last one, in Hebrews 10, that's the one book that God chooses to put that verse, encourage one another to keep coming back to church, exhort one another, not to forsake the assembling of themselves, as the manner of some is. And I wonder if that's because it's so fellowship. Relationships are one of the key ways to maintain our faith in difficult times. And of course, there are other ways. The Bible says, the Bible also really has an emphasis on remember back. It's always about remember in the Old Testament. Zach means remember. Remember back. It constantly is saying to what God did for you in the past, so that when you get in a place where it doesn't look like God's doing anything good, be like Jesus the night before his death. Oh, my God, why are you forsaking me? But it's all a quote from Psalm 22. God, you've always saved me in the past. You've always come through. It seems like you're taking 13 years is way too long, but I'm trusting you. You've done it in the past. And sure enough, he does finally come through.
So, Jim, is that part of a Hebrew tradition to do with one of the festivals where you...
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm a big fan of The Chosen. And in the last season that I have seen, there's a ritual around the Last Supper where they are saying, even if he hadn't done this, it would have been enough. Yeah. And even if he hadn't done this, it would have been enough. Yeah. And they go around the table. Is that part of that?
I don't think that. I think that's an extra. I think that's a tradition that's added from the book of Daniel. Remember where the 3 men came out of, even if, O king, he doesn't deliver us, though we believe he will, even then we trust him. But of course, all those Jewish festivals are all remembrance festivals. It's all remember back. So build the booth to remind you of the booths you built the night before you got out of Egypt, when God took care of you. So that remembering back to what God's done in the past and reading good missionary stories or stories of deliverance or stories of Mary Ann, like I read, that encourages your heart. You say, God's done it. He's brought other people back. But then, because we're relational people, this morning at what were we doing? We're handing out food this morning.
Harvesters.
Yeah, Harvesters.
Yeah.
So I get together with a guy that I don't know. He doesn't come to our church. Got a really long beard, and he's lost his wife, and he lives alone. And he says, I'm lonely. And he says, I'm a writer. And I said, it's interesting. He says, yeah. And he mentioned the book he's written. He said, I'm working on a book right now. He says, it's strange, but the title of the book is Relationships, because I miss them. I need them. I want them. I just realized now, finally, the importance of relationships.
Wow.
Isn't that sweet?
It is. It is. And sad.
Yeah.
That we have to get to a certain age or experience a certain kind of loss before we realize that. Jim, As always, I enjoy our conversations.
My pleasure.
Anything else to add?
No, I think we covered it all.
I think that's plenty of extra, don't you?
Yeah.
All right. Thank you so much, friend.
My
Thank
pleasure.
you for listening. We will be back next week as we continue onward with Onward. I will never get tired of saying that. I hope you have a fantastic week.
Thank you for listening to the TBC Extra Podcast. Please subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Play, or wherever you get your podcasts.